Well, good morning, everybody. If you're joining us from the United States, at least on the East Coast, and good evening if you're joining us from Singapore, as our speaker is. My name is Anne-Marie Murphy, and on behalf of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University, the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Seton Hall, the New York Southeast Asian Network, and the APEC Studies Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Myanmar's foreign policy towards the United States. This morning's talk is part of a virtual conference series called Southeast Asia Views America, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects, which aims to assess the tenor of bilateral relations between the United States and key Southeast Asian countries as the Biden administration begins its effort to engage regional allies and partners after the unilateral American first stance of his predecessor. At the time of President Biden's inauguration in January, his foreign policy team believed that they would be interacting with the Myanmar government led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League of Democracy, which won an overwhelming majority in Myanmar's November 2020 elections. On February 1st, however, the military overthrew the elected government, triggering massive protest demonstrations and a violent crackdown by the military that has led to an estimated 818 civilian deaths, triggering what some call the Biden administration's first foreign policy crisis. The current political crisis in Myanmar, however, is not the first time that the Burmese or Myanmar government's brutal suppression of dissent has created challenges for the country's bilateral relations with the United States. And to help us understand the historical patterns and how, if at all, they may influence today's relationship between Myanmar and the United States, we are extremely fortunate to have as our speaker today, Mo Thuzar. Mo Thuzar is a fellow and coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Program at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies at the Yusuf Ishak Institute. She is a doctoral candidate at the National University of Singapore. Earlier in her career, she headed the ASEAN Secretariat's Human Development Unit, and she also worked for the Myanmar Foreign Service. Her research interests include ASEAN integration and issues and Myanmar foreign policy. And to provide commentary from the American perspective, we're extremely fortunate to have as our discussant today, Murray Heber. Murray is a senior associate of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He earlier served as senior advisor and deputy director of the CSIS program. And prior to joining CIS, he was a senior director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he is a longtime journalist and most recently the author of In the Dragon's Shadow. So the way we're going to proceed today is that Mo Thuzar will make her presentation. We'll then have commentary from Murray, and the session will be open to Q&A. So the Q&A function is open. Please feel free to put your questions and comments in. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to you, Mo.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Good morning to everybody who's tuning in there on the other side of the world. It's good to see quite a few familiar names in the participant list, and I'm glad to have your interest this morning, and of course look forward to more discussion. Because I am going to take a step back, if it is possible to take a step back at all, from the tragedy that's going on in my country. I'm in Singapore, so it is with that sense of, I think, frustration and helplessness that all of us Burmese national citizens who are overseas are following events back home in Myanmar. So I'm going to take a step back in the sense that I will be drawing on the research that I've been doing for my dissertation, which really looks at the personal history element of diplomacy and foreign relations, foreign policy from the Burmese, from the Myanmar perspective. But of course, I will try to relate what I am presenting to the current situation in Myanmar and leave some time for further discussion of what's going on. So I'd like to start my screen share of the presentation, of the overview that I have of this paper that I am contributing to this really interesting project that Anne-Marie is coordinating on Southeast Asian policy towards the United States, perceptions, policies, and prospects. And I'd like to thank Anne-Marie for her patience and encouragement in, in including me and waiting for my inputs despite all the difficulties. So this is the title: Burma, Myanmar, and the United States, the dilemma of a delicate balance. And as I mentioned, I'm giving the Myanmar perspective. So this is just kind of like a quick table of contents, if you will. I just try to situate it within the context of the research that I'm doing, which looks at foreign policy from the history perspective. And I try to explain what I mean by misperceptions in the abstract of this presentation. I'll then try to look at the parallels of the domestic underpinnings of Burma, later Myanmar's policy towards the US, and basically situated within the context of Burma, Myanmar's foreign policy, which I think I can find similar strands of this quest for legitimacy, if you will, that we are also seeing happening post February 1, after the junta of the State Administration Council seized power. Then I will dwell a bit into domestic, as in Burmese, perceptions and attitudes towards the United States, but I differentiate between, say, popular or perceptions from people who have been receiving information through the usual means of traditional and social media, as well as from the policy elites, who will, of course, have more input into policy making. Then I'll end with a couple of thoughts on what next, and the eternal nexus that I'm always interested in about Myanmar, US, ASEAN, and of course, the big neighbor to the north knocking around in the background. So very quickly, this is just the kind of research or academic grounding that I want to highlight in terms of history, looking at foreign policy and, of course, external relations from the history point of view. In the interest of time, I'll just move on to explaining what I mean about misperceptions. I interpret misperceptions, or when I say misperceptions in my paper on this topic, I'm actually thinking misplaced expectations. And misplaced expectations, there are aplenty when it comes to, I think, Burma's relations, external relations, and I think the kind of role that they wish the United States could take vis-a-vis the country, if not the region. And of course, another term that I'm using, or a question that I'm asking, is legitimacy. And here I am talking more about political and popular legitimacy, of course, the latter through elections. But also there is this aspect of the legal or the legitimate status in the eyes of the international community. And this is what we are seeing happening more post February the 1st. And the questions that I have throughout while I was researching this paper was whether the Burmese policymakers conflate perceptions and expectations, and what does history tell us, the historical parallels about this quest for legitimacy. So I'll dive straight in. The delicate balance that I borrowed for my title comes from Professor Kenton Clymer's 2015 book on A Delicate Relationship, the United States and Burma, Myanmar since 1945. And in that book, where he uses archives and of course interviews with a whole range of experts and practitioners and academics, the US attitudes towards Burma since 1945 are summarized there. In the Cold War years, it was anti-communism, and moving through the 70s, 80s, and even after, I think, the 1988 military coup, it was more about drug trafficking interventions and debates on the democracy movement. supporting the democracy movement and moving for regime change from the State Law and Order Restoration Council military regime, later the State Peace and Development Council, towards democracy and the transition towards democracy. And in that transition, I think highlighting more the values-based foreign policy and human rights situation in Myanmar. And, I think that later debate has also been where sanctions and symbols, particularly the symbolic nature of the bilateral relationship, I think has been also come under discussion in recent years. The Burmese or the Myanmar attitudes towards the United States, basically it's distilled from the conversations I've had with former diplomats, former Burmese diplomats, members of the Myanmar Foreign Service, who have taken their time to talk to me about foreign policy attitudes and perceptions, and of course, bilateral relations with different powers. So the quest for legitimacy, after independence in 1948, or independence from the British in 1948, through to, I guess, I would say the military coup in 1962, Prime Minister U Nu, heading the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League government, I think was really looking at that kind of legitimacy in the international arena, because there was that popular legitimacy with the role of his party and the efforts that had been made to negotiate independence. But that quest for that greater international role was, I think, his interest to somehow mediate between East and West, namely China and India, because he was famously quoted for talking about being a tender gourd between two cactuses, or is it cacti? And of course, he meant China and the U.S., but he also meant China and India. And I think this was something that was a bit of a surprise, because there was also the strict neutrality that he promoted, and of course, being part of the founding countries for the non-aligned movement, which was not that popular in the Cold War era, or the Cold War, the binary tensions and choices that countries and governments faced, and his advocation of peaceful existence based on Buddhist principles, I think really made him quite unique in putting his thumbprint on the international stage. And of course, here it can be contrasted between the kind of international role that, say, U Nu's close associate, someone who had assisted him in the Ministry of Information, U Tan, who later became Secretary General of the United Nations. It is to be contrasted with that kind of role, where I guess if there was a mediator, it was U Tan, but of course he did that in his UN Secretary General capacity. And I think U Nu's play that he wrote, that later was adapted by a Hollywood movie company into a movie in the Burmese language with Burmese actors, I think was the kind of point where perceptions in the US towards U Nu's role was really, okay, this person stands for anti-communism. Whereas that play that U Nu wrote that was adapted into a movie really was about justifying that the ethnic armed groups who had started insurgencies should not take up arms and should not go around, terrorizing communities, but go through the legal means of elections to raise their political grievances and concerns. And in those days, of course, the force between these ethnic armed uprisings and peace and stability and democracy was the military, the diplomats. So that was those eras. But it was the military, the diplomats, the commander-in-chief of which was General Ne Win, who later deposed Nu in a military coup. After experimenting with the constitutional coup from 1958 to 1960, The 1962 military coup, where Ne Win basically deposed Nu, was the beginning of Ne Win trying to differentiate himself as being better than Nu by proposing the Burmese way to socialism. And his purported dislike of the United States, I think, was also balanced with this need for recognition. He paid a visit in 1966, and the president of the United States at that time was Lyndon B. Johnson. And of course, in the 1970s, Ne Win was trying to also differentiate his foreign policy, even though he continued neutrality. He tried to nuance it as independent and active foreign policy, and used in a very similar way to Nu, personal diplomacy, particularly among the Southeast Asian countries, to project his role. Even though he refused to join ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as a founding member. Big mistake. But his Burmese way to socialism basically led to the whole economy crumbling, and voices for democracy, for freedom of expression, all based on pocketbook concerns, basically based on the economic situation of the people in the country, and their thirst for information and equality on a par with countries around them, led to the democracy movement that culminated in the 8888 uprising, which was put down brutally by the State Law and Order Restoration Council, headed by General Saw Mao. And this later morphed into the State Peace and Development Council, where his number two, General, later Senior General Than Shwe, basically deposed him and took over the reins of power. And it was in these years, these post-1988 years, that we saw alignments and isolation, and also attempts to seek a regional role by trying to rejoin the non-aligned movement and to join ASEAN. Not so much a regional role as in, I think, just trying to find a grouping and an association in which I think the view from the foreign ministry was the generals could learn by seeing and observing what was going on around them. But unfortunately, I think the generals did not see it that way. They saw ASEAN particularly more as an area where they could broaden their maneuvering space and somehow manipulate that space. And we do see echoes of that coming up again. So the kind of blip in all of this was 2011 to 2015, under what was still a quasi-civilian military-backed government led by Thein Sein. Nevertheless, the more surprising political and economic reform and administrative reforms took place. There was a diversification of diplomacy, if you will, and with the West, with the US setting the tone of a matching action for action under the Obama administration, I think that quest for legitimacy became something of a performance legitimacy. And I think the Thein Sein administration was fully aware that they were only there for 5 years, for that 5-year term as a seat warmer, if you will, for the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who had marked their time as opposition and basically rejoined the political process as the legal opposition under the Thein Sein administration. And so in 2015, with the first landslide win of the National League for Democracy, I think basically the whole world celebrated together with Myanmar. But we saw that Aung San Suu Kyi's thumbprint on I think, the building on that popular legitimacy. She wanted to have the political legitimacy on her own terms, which meant really fulfilling the promises that had been made in the elections of changing or amending the constitution and taking on the military, which never really was under civilian control. They had retained, and under the 2008 constitution to this day, the appointment of the defense, home affairs, and border affairs ministers are directly by the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. plus having a 25% presence in the parliament. So this is just a longish summary of the different quests for legitimacy that also, I think, shaped the way the different leaderships of Burma, later Myanmar, tried to engage with the world and the United States. I think post-88 up to 2011, 12, there really was a big gap in knowing one's counterpart in the State Department. And I think there's also that gap, I think the impact of that is also being felt to this day. Going on to perceptions and attitudes, there are more favorable sentiments towards the US, and well, as opposed to China. And it's really sort of like a reverse of you know, the resentment towards China with the expectations of US engagement in the context of democracy. And in the survey that I mentioned that I did in 2015 or so, the main associations were upward associations. So people in Myanmar, at least the younger generation, people who have access to information and so on, really view the United States as a powerhouse of development, education advances, technology, and power and influence. Because that survey took place during the Obama administration, I think Obama's name is mentioned the most by people's one-word responses to how they viewed America. And there were also references to a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So this is what I call probably they are Gen Z. They were young undergraduates at the time I did the survey, and I was just sharing with Anne-Marie and Murray earlier that I'm sure several of them, if not all of them, are probably also protesting out on the streets. But contrasting that with the policy elite, my institute has carried out annual State of Southeast Asia surveys for the past 3 years, and I've been trying to track the Myanmar respondents because I know who they are, and they are from a wide swathe of ministries, including the Ministry of Defense, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with a few cabinet ministers thrown in. They were largely skeptical of the US role in the region and quite pragmatic about China's presence. So I'd just like to show some of the findings comparing last year and this year. I think the trust in the US overall by the 10 member states, by policy elites in the 10 member states of ASEAN has increased quite a bit compared to last year. So there's increased confidence that, you know, the Biden administration will elevate American engagement with the region. And if there was a choice, since last year, it was pretty clear that people would choose the United States. And then again, if ASEAN were forced to align itself with one of the two strategic rivals, which should it choose? If you look at what the Myanmar responses were, it's kind of like a 49-51 type of situation where now I think attitudes are split kind of half-half on who to go with China, although China still seems to have that slight edge. But then we need to balance that with looking at attitudes on China as a revisionist power taking over the US role in the region. And here again, if you look at how the respondents from Myanmar are viewing it, they really want, I think, to counter that by strengthening resilience rather than seeking out a third party. If it has to be a choice of not siding or siding with one or the other. This slide basically shows that there is more optimism for engagement under the Biden administration as opposed to under the Trump administration. And the 3 bars that you see on the top are for ASEAN overall. Again, for the Myanmar responses, there is quite a high expectation, I would say, that US engagement would increase under the new Biden administration. Now, this was done in November, in the afterglow of the election wins in both Myanmar and in the United States, and of course, long before the February 1st coup. Well, at least 2 months before. And so here, these are views about confidence as the US as a provider of regional security. Again, I'm just looking at Myanmar responses because that's what I'm tracking. And it seems that the confidence percentage have increased since last year, although there's still quite a significant number of fence sitters if you look at the no comment column here. So that's something to think about. And again, this trust issue that the survey likes to ask about, whether China, the US, Japan, the EU, India, and later the South Korea would do the right thing. Confidence levels are also higher from the Myanmar respondents for the US stepping up to that role. So I know I'm going a bit over time. I'd just like to end with prospects and implications. And it's really murky right now after the February 1st coup. I think about a day or so after the coup, I co-wrote an article about how the generals are really making a return to the dark days. And with the current situation right now, with deaths exceeding now 850 and detentions over 5,000, with quite well over 2/3 of that number still in detention and warrants for arrest out. And now the armed response that we are seeing, guerrilla tactics by People's Defense Force, local militias being formed and trying to fight back with whatever weapons they have, responding to the brutal violence by the junta security forces, I think creates for more anxiety and tension. And again, we are seeing contests for legitimacy by the National Unity Government, which comprises the elected representatives from the 2020 elections, and basically broadly trying to represent that loose coalition around the resistance movement and the junta in the form of the State Administration Council. And as we've seen in that slide, I talked about legitimacy and the quest for it. It's not without precedent, but I don't think there are any good options at present on how I think the world engages either the junta or the National Unity Government formally. And then there is the ASEAN Factor. There was supposed to be an ASEAN-US foreign ministers meeting, but it was postponed due to a technical glitch. It was supposed to be a virtual meeting. And there is the ASEAN-China foreign ministers meeting scheduled for June. And I'm just thinking, is that still on? Interesting here, Myanmar is the country that has the rotational responsibility for coordinating ASEAN-China cooperation from this year until 2024. So that's an interesting twist to that. This is, I think, the situation when it comes to the ASEAN Factor. They have, I think collectively as a group, ASEAN, of course, believes in its constructive engagement and trying to, I think, try to find the humanitarian aspect to the political and economic and social crisis that's going on in Myanmar to gain that quote unquote entry point. But I think the window for even gaining that entry point is really narrowing right now. And there is this sense of urgency. We are seeing this also from different voices in this region in Southeast Asia, calling for ASEAN as a grouping to really get its act together and start implementing that 5-point consensus that was reached at in Jakarta a month ago, which the junta has now tried to backtrack on. And I'll end by flashing this photo of a cartoon contest that was done by Reporting ASEAN a few years ago. And this is the entry from Myanmar. ASEAN is still seen as being in China's shadow. And I think this is the kind of geopolitical reality that we'll have to think about whenever we look at domestic attitudes towards countries like the United States. I'll stop here and I apologize for going over time. Anne-Marie, back to you.
No need to apologize. That was a very fascinating tour through history that I think for American viewers in particular who have only followed the coup recently. It provides some very fascinating background information. At this point, Murray, I'm going to turn it over to you for some commentary.
Great. Great. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, Mo, for that really interesting overview from Myanmar's perceptions and perspective. I will talk a little bit about how Myanmar has looked and looks now in the U.S. I think one thing that always has fascinated me is that after World War II, effectively, when Myanmar got its independence, I'm going to just refer to Myanmar. I know they changed their name after 1988, but it's easier just to use one name. But after it got independence, it never snared the attention of its neighbors on mainland China, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. Maybe one of the differences is that the Indo-Chinese countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were French colonies, and France asked for the U.S. help in returning them to colonies after they declared their independence after World War II. But Britain readily gave independence to, such as it was, to Myanmar. And then after the communist victory in China, the U.S. saw the independence wars in the three countries of Indochina as proxy wars to block the spread of communism. And then, of course, Thailand was viewed as a sort of a bulwark of standing up to the communists developing in the three countries of Indochina. So it played really a critical role. But the U.S. only had, over the next, while the wars are going on in neighboring countries, the U.S. had a very low-level relations with Myanmar, small aid program, but it never got the focus, despite its significance, of a country with a very strategic location at the crossroads from China to Southeast Asia, from India to Southeast Asia, from India to China. At the end of World War II, Myanmar was one of the two wealthiest countries in Asia. It's sort of stunning to realize now that those two countries were Myanmar and the Philippines, but Myanmar had a strong education system, a good healthcare system, and foreigners that were living in Thailand in the early 50s tell you they used to go to Yangon for healthcare treatment, surgery, et cetera. And today it's a country of 54 million people. It's a pretty significant country. And Myanmar, as Mo alluded to, really got onto the U.S. radar in 1988 during the brutal crackdown when the junta, the military, crushed the pro-democracy uprising. And then from 1988 to about 2009, 10, 11, in that period, the U.S. basically had a narrow focus on human rights, democracy, prompting it to impose sanctions. And they were being piled on by both the administration and Congress over the decades for any of misdeeds done by the military. And then after 1980, when the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi overwhelmingly won an election, which the military rejected, but the U.S. then started also focusing on regime change in favor of the NLD. And again, this is a major contrast, especially as we move to the late 1990s and 2000 with the neighboring countries like China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, which was often run by the military after coups. But the US saw all these countries as either very strategic or there were economic reasons why it wanted to relate to them. And there was almost universal agreement in Washington. There was terribly little debate with Congress or within Congress or academia that the military regime should be toppled. And it was only after Obama took office in 2009 and the military actually it had changed its constitution in 2008, which wasn't very democratic, but it wasn't really till around March 2009, when the military did reach out it was small signals that were sent from like the UN ambassador to the Myanmar ambassador to the UN, that change was afoot and trying to urge the administration to change its views of Myanmar. And then, so then the president Thein Sein launched a ton of reforms. He very quickly freed the press, basically allowed cheap SIM cards so that everybody could get a cell phone. He freed political prisoners. He liberalized a lot of our state-controlled economy, much greater openness. At that point, the U.S. started to begin to move to lift sanctions very gradually. Secretary Clinton visited Myanmar, followed by Obama visiting. The U.S. in 2012 set up a full USAID office, and so there was a bit of a honeymoon period at that point. But as we got into the second Myanmar Obama administration and we approached the 2015 elections, you started to hear some concerns about the fact that, well, the concerns have been expressed all along, but they were again being focused on that the military still controlled 25% of parliamentary seats. And the military refused to consider a constitutional change like Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD were asking for. And then Aung San Suu Kyi took office. Really, it was she really actually moved backwards from some of Thein Sein's moves, especially in press freedom and some of those things. But relations really took a hit over the head when the military attacked the Rohingya after an ASA attack in Rakhine State in August 2017. By the end of the year, some 700,000 Rohingya had fled to Myanmar, to Bangladesh, sorry. And then in December 2017, the US imposed visa restrictions, financial sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act on top generals. The US continued some engagement, but it really recognized that Myanmar really was beginning to take steps backward. And then, so we had the 2020 election and followed by the coup. And after the coup on February 1st, it's interesting that the new Biden administration very quickly used the playbook that its predecessors had implemented after 1988. For basically 30 years, the U.S. policy focused on imposing sanctions on military leaders, military companies. It didn't do much, which we now see didn't do much other than push Myanmar closer to China. But ultimately, China started irritating the junta, and it started to look for alternatives, like happened under the Thein Sein administration. And so, again, the U.S. redirected some of its assistance to the border areas, to civil society organizations. It froze the assets that the Burmese government had access to in the U.S. And started to provide aid to healthcare and civil society organizations, like I said. To be honest, I mean, the U.S. obviously, in response to the coup, faced a lot of challenges because none of the neighbors, from China, obviously, as we already know, but India, Thailand, Singapore, Japan, nobody wanted to interfere in the internal affairs of Myanmar. So it was really difficult for the U.S. to figure out really what it could do. But I'll end with some comments about the Biden administration as it exists at the moment. would generally be fair to say that in the first 5 months, the new administration is not really focused on Southeast Asia. There was a lot of talk after the election and before the inauguration that Southeast Asia would be a major focus, but now we don't really see that happening. Southeast Asia policy seems to be on the back burner, a bit adrift. Now you have to recognize, of course, that the administration was very busy setting up a new administration, appointing new officials, tackling COVID, dealing with economic recovery. It had to figure out what to do about China, but really it has focused far more on the Quad, for example, the grouping between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. It seems to think that there is more opportunity for making progress there than it does through relating to Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And it's interesting, I don't like to give the Trump guys much credit, but it's interesting to remember that by this point in the Trump administration, Vice President Pence had gone to Jakarta and given a speech at the ASEAN Secretariat about the importance of ASEAN. And Trump had also hosted Vietnamese Prime Minister Phuc from Vietnam in Washington. Now, granted, a lot of the people are not yet in the saddle in a lot of the buildings in Washington that are very critical. Among those are the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia and the Pacific. Things may change when Ambassador Dan Prittenbrink is finally confirmed and in the saddle. He may be able to get more focus on Southeast Asia. And then, of course, we have the visit this week by Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who is going to visit Jakarta, Bangkok, and Phnom Penh. And it may be that the administration does give more strong signals about the importance of Southeast Asia, but at this point, we haven't really seen it. So with that, I'm going to stop, Anne-Marie, turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Murray. And it's nice now to have the perspective from the United States as well as Myanmar. I just want to remind our audience that the Q&A is open, so please feel free to post some comments in there. I'm going to use my position as moderator, maybe to go back for a minute and ask Mo, since you've been talking about perceptions and legitimacy, to talk a little bit more about the Myanmar general's view of the region and how they view legitimacy. So for example, in your discussion, you mentioned that in the 1990s when Myanmar joined ASEAN, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs hoped that they could get the generals out to the region and presumably see the economic development, the social equality, the way in which a country like Indonesia had been able to manage its social diversity. And, it's interesting because when we look at a case like Vietnam, ASEAN leaders, particularly Indonesia's, played a key role in trying to change perceptions of the Vietnamese leaders of what the future could hold if they withdrew from Cambodia. And so I'd be interested in learning a little bit more about how the Myanmar junta views legitimacy at this point, because there was discussion at one point that the reason they actually went through with the political transition was because so many of their military-owned companies needed greater integration in order to profit better, that promoting economic development would be a new form of legitimacy. And so they must have known, given the history of the sanctions, that they would be sacrificing that. So can you speak on those kinds of questions a bit more.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And also thank you, Marae, for rounding out the discussion just now with the view from the US. And I had a couple of concluding thoughts that also included the Rohingya issue, but I'll save them for later, and I'll quickly go to Anne-Marie's question, because this really, I think, highlights the way that the military, the generals in Myanmar, they really act like a state within a state. And this is what's been brewing. David Steinberg has written about this for ICIS, about, the four coups in Burma, in Myanmar, since the 1950s onwards, 1958 onwards. So it is really, I think, continuing with that notion of privileging the military above all else, and which continues. And so the establishment of the military state-owned enterprises, the suggestions that were made were, yes, to introduce, I think, the generals to a new way of going about this legitimacy via the Vietnam route, as you've so rightly pointed out, Anne-Marie. But I think what happened in the case of the generals in Myanmar was that, well, there's no way of sugarcoating it. They got greedy. I mean, the military-owned, state-owned enterprises that were established in the early 1990s were one way of, exposing the military regime to doing business with the world and engaging the world and opening up through economic, liberalization of reforms. So there was some, I think, attempt at liberalization in around 1992, but they didn't go as far. I mean, they stopped short. And I think this was because of the very real narrative that the military has among themselves about control and security and how that relates to regime security. So there were these dynamics going on. And I do happen to know that, Senior General Than Shwe did see the military-owned, state-owned enterprises as the kind of income-generating entities for a time when, and this is to use his words, when we go back to the barracks. And so the 2009 transition, the 2009, 2010 elections, those kinds of feelers being sent out to the world about changes afoot was really part of General Than Shwe's plan to orchestrate this transition to democracy on his own terms. So if anybody has to write a handbook on having your cake and eating it as a dictator, I think it's Than Shwe who should write it. He's enjoying his retirement somewhere in Naypyidaw. And it's really interesting when you relate it to the current coup and the quest for legitimacy, and how someone like Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, the head honcho right now of the State Administration Council, is thinking about all of this, because none of the cost benefit analysis that should have been done would have showed that there is benefit to mounting this coup rather than all the costs that he's facing. And I think basically they just did not calculate that economic factor well enough, in the sense that Myanmar today in 2021 is much more connected to regional and global supply chains. It is trying to participate in the ASEAN economic community, and it has much more economic links than in, say, post-1988 or even the early 1990s. And so I think that was a miscalculation about, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, I think in those kind of 5 or 6 points that were issued on February the 1st after the coup, was effected, there was one about being a more business-friendly administration, and also doing better at governance than its predecessor, than the National League for Democracy. But I think they thought that the business community and the economic links and engagements that Myanmar had would somehow quickly gloss over to the kind of stability that the State Law and Order Restoration Council could impose post-1988. But what we're seeing right now is the civil disobedience movement, where essentially, people who get things done, who who are paper pushers, who bring things, who process payments, who do all the things that keep a bureaucracy running. Those are the people who are participating in the civil disobedience movement. Most of them have been in the economic sectors, and now we're also seeing a huge number of teachers, professors, lecturers in the education sector participating in the civil disobedience movement and also being sacked or dismissed for it. So this actually, I think, affected the economy so much a few weeks into the coup. That was I think, the economic impact that the generals did not calculate properly. And they can say all they like that they are used to sanctions, they are used to walking with a few friends. But I think the targeted creative sanctions are feeling their impact. If I'm not mistaken, there have been targeted sanctions placed on Senior General Min Aung Hlaing's 2 children who also have significant business interests. So I think that's the kind of way to go in terms of that. So the legitimacy that the current junta wants is really to be recognized as the sole representative politically of Myanmar. And they have done this in the ASEAN context. They have sent letters to the ASEAN Secretariat insisting that it is the junta appointed representatives or the representatives representing the junta who are representing Myanmar and trying to block, I think, representations from the national unity government. So I think it's more about asserting this political legitimacy. And later on, I think that's why they're holding out this notion of an election later on, and thinking that they could shore up economic legitimacy, which has backfired big time up to now.
So can I just ask you a question then? I mean, clearly, if they didn't do the right cost benefit calculation initially, now in the face of the civil disobedience movement and the sanctions that are pouring in, they are seeing the costs, even if, as you note, they are trying to mitigate them by, moving to ASEAN and others. So can I ask you, is there a point at which the costs will get so high, if not to perceptions of the military, then to their children? So for example, as somebody who studies Indonesia a fair bit, in 1988 98, we got 2 8s with the 2 countries, the military ultimately, in the crackdown it began, stepped back in part because the military and the elites knew they were shooting their own children. And so the way in which the economy and society had diversified away from just the military-backed regime to younger generations with those links to the broader economy, as you know, ultimately led to restraint. Everything that I have read thus far on Myanmar is that the military is separate from the rest of society, almost extremely insular. And so some of those considerations and costs do not register with the junta's leaders, despite, as you know, Min Aung Hlaing's 2 children being sanctioned. Is that kind of thing ultimately perhaps going to change views, or do you have no hope for that?
Wow, there's so many layers to talk about there. Okay, I think in terms of the cost and where will they start feeling that? They have started to feel that in the economic sectors. Some of the railways, I think, still can't function fully because almost all the railway workers were on strike under the civil disobedience movement. And when the military started shooting protesters, several of these workers, railway workers, shipyard workers, have paid for it with their lives, among many others. So this is what the junta right now is trying to do, is to force people back into work. They have tried to force the banks to open again, but there are long lines of people queuing for tokens to withdraw money. There have been limits set on the amount of money that you can withdraw in a day. And private banks, I think, can't even guarantee that kind of same amount of money as say the central bank. So it's really, I think this is going to affect the economy in different ways when, Myanmar has always been a really cash-based society. And we were starting to see changes, nascent changes of that with mobile money transfers, with the way that the agriculture and farming communities could get access to credit and so on. And so now we're reverted back into this really relying on cash and putting money under mattresses kind of a situation again. And this is going to have those knock-on effects on an important economic sector, which is the agricultural sector. And the rainy season is going to start, the monsoon is going to start, farmers are going to have to start thinking about planting crops and so on. So there are all these, I think, knock-on consequences that the junta probably did not think that the coup and the after effects lasting into now what is almost 4 months would be in this kind of a limbo situation. So they are trying to use coercion to force people back to work for those who were participating in the CDM or taking leave and trying not to go to work under a junta bureaucracy. And for schools and banks, I mean, banks have been forced to reopen, schools are next. So June the 1st is when schools all start, when schools open, when semester starts in Myanmar. And government schools, I think, are slated to open. Universities opened earlier, but university students were boycotting classes. I'm not so sure about grade schools, but the teachers are on strike. The university lecturers and professors who were on strike have been sacked, and I think a lot of the criteria and requirements for their replacements, the junta has relaxed those. So you're looking also at the quality of education going forward. It's not even substitute teachers. I think they're trying to get people working for daily wages to be substitute teachers. So there's all these I think ad hoc kind of measures and decisions, which I think to me shows that the junta didn't really think about all these knock-on consequences. And so there's that one thing. Now about the military being insulated, definitely the top echelons, of course, they are all held together by this common fear of being hauled in front of the international court. And if my if the Rohingya question, I think currently at the ICJ, there's a report due in June or July, and whichever entity that is asserting legitimacy in the international arena submits that report, I think we need to kind of like be watching out for that. So the military being insular and insulated, yes, at the top echelons, but there have been so many defections going on right now among members of the police force who are supposed to be under the Ministry of Home Affairs, but in fact were being told or forced to or instructed to do the dirty work of the military in the early weeks of the crackdowns against the protests. So we've got members of the police force defecting and members, the rank and file members of the military defecting, but recently it's gone up to officer levels. So from those defections, anyway, the number of I think the numbers that the military likes to highlight about its troop strength and so on, I think we have to take that with a grain of salt. But I have been told by someone who is in the know that this is in a normal year, quote unquote, there will be defections going on for certain economic reasons because life is hard for the rank and file. They don't get the benefits that the top echelon gets and shares, right? So defections are normal, but starting post February the 1st, 2021, we're looking at maybe up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 type of defections. And they will only continue because the rank and file will have family in the community. So they are not insulated. And part of one of the social punishment moves that people did was to really, I think, also target in their own way families of security forces living in the community and refusing to interact with them in the marketplace, refusing to sell them produce and services. So there is that kind of dynamic going on as well.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. Okay, so I am going to get to the questions in 1 minute, but I did want to follow up on this issue of international legitimacy that you discussed from the very beginning, Mo. Clearly, those of us, and Murray will have seen this in Washington, you know, we have seen repeated attempts in meetings by the National Unity Government, right, which consists of in part, the CHRP, the elected members who would have been representatives of the NLD, mostly in parliament, with many groups of the ethnic organizations, and they have been trying to secure international legitimacy. And now to turn it back to the United States, clearly, as you noted in your presentation, the Rohingya issue really served as a huge barrier to the further development of relations. And even now, when the NUG government is seeking support in Washington, the fact that there is not a forward plan for the Rohingya, the fact that so many of the leaders of the NUG government were NLDs, and of course Aung San Suu Kyi supported, or at least did not protest, the government's treatment of the Rohingya. So how do you view this contest for international legitimacy? Because it seems, and Murray, correct me if I'm wrong, from the US perspective, that you're not going to have the same kind of support for the opposition following this coup that you did after 1988 and then the elections of 1990, when US policy was really pretty much to support the NLDs, support Aung San Suu Kyi, follow her suggestions for sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see this relationship between the NUG and the United States?
I think the National Unity Government realizes that this movement, this resistance against the military, is so much more than the NLD. I think it's really an outcry of people, you know, voicing the desire for their right to choose their own government and criticize their own government in that space that they have. That's the issue. And so you see this, I think this need to reach out to the ethnic stakeholders. You see this as a legitimacy move, again, another layer, by both the SAC, by the military junta, and the NUG, by trying to include representatives of ethnic political parties in their cabinet structure. And the NUG, I think, is also developing a policy, a position with regard to the Rohingya issue. They are starting to look at granting citizenship once the repatriation issue is sorted out. And we've seen also this admission, this recognition, this blinkers coming off people's perceptions again towards the Rohingya, the attitudes towards the Rohingya, in the context of the protests and the violence, the crackdowns against the protesters. That, oh my goodness, if they are doing this to a majority of Burma protesters everywhere, even though all the protests were actually across the country, in at least the 316 townships of the 330 townships in Myanmar nationwide. I think people were just like coming into a realization that if the military can do this to us, what have they been doing to the ethnic groups, the Kachins, the Karens, all these years, and how much of that information has been filtered from us? And then how much more then have the atrocities been for the Rohingya, which were completely under the thumb of the Ministry of Home Affairs, Defense, and the military authorities in Rakhine State. So I think there is that awakening that's coming up across class, religion, ethnicities. It's too early to say yet because, of course, there are going to be extremist views on both sides. But I think the NUG realizes that, and that's why they are coming out to talk about developing a policy, considering joining the Rome Statute, and also maybe even like I said, considering and going about this dismantling of the citizenship law and granting citizenship and so on. So, but all of these are processes, right? And the current interest that they have right now is to really get back that whole process of democratization and getting a civilian government back into power, which is going to be more of a longer drawn out process than anyone anticipated, I guess. Or maybe looking at history, we should anticipate a longer drawn out process.
Okay, Murray.
Yeah, so the US views the situation roughly like Mo spelled out from the larger international community. So yes, of course, senior State Department officials, people in Congress have met the NUG. The NUG, as you said, has been in a veritable campaign in Washington, seeing everybody they possibly can to try to get support. But it really, nobody's talking about seriously about offering support. Part of it is, as Mo said, that there's a recognition that the NUG at this point is still very NLD and doesn't really, although they have a few senior officials from some, or senior people from some of the ethnic groups, it really doesn't represent all the people of Myanmar yet at this point. And of course, there is the dark cloud of the Rohingya hanging over, and people are interested in what they're saying about possible repatriation, but it's kind of notional at this point because they aren't the government. I'd be curious as what they would do if they really got power, but there's no way the US is going to recognize them anytime soon, and they do not have the prestige of the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi in 1990.
And that's the crux of the matter, Murray, because there's two ways of looking at the NUG. They're going all out on the PR blitz and really trying to talk about they are the interlocutors if you want to talk about getting things back on track. And they've also reached out to ASEAN in the same way that they have reached out to the US. But I think ASEAN also, holds that similar kind of wariness, if you will, about to what extent can the NUG speak for the rest of the ethnic armed groups and the opposition, the resistance, the different civil society representatives and so on. So I think, like I said, two ways of looking at it. As an interim government, if they present whichever elected government comes in with a fait accompli, do they have enough of that credibility and push with the senior leadership of the NLD government to do that, to actually put together a fait accompli, which is what they say that they are trying to do in terms of the federal charter, the move for a federal army and all of that, which will have consequences beyond the vision, of course. So there's one thing. Or will there be that question mark about, because they are an interim entity, whoever comes into power as an elected government or the NLD leadership later on, will they be able to then reverse those things? So I think there are two question marks ways of looking at it right now. Just a quick response.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm just reminding our audience that we do have the Q&A box open. So let me go to one of them, because one of the questions, actually, I'm proud to say from a Seton Hall student, is regarding the role of Myanmar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We've seen the ambassador to London come out in support of the opposition movement and get locked out of the embassy. We've seen many Myanmar diplomats throughout the world coming out in support of the opposition movement, speaking for the CHRP and others. So obviously they're delegitimizing the Myanmar government. Can I ask you how closely they are working with the NUG? And related to that, one of the things that is different this time in Myanmar is the role of the Myanmarese diaspora, right? In the way in which they are publicizing, seeking support, providing support back home, financial and otherwise. How, if at all, does that change both the foreign policy aspect as well as the ability of some in the opposition movement with those ties to survive in their protests and opposition?
Right, two parts. I think the first part of your question, Anne-Marie, relates to the question posed by Natalia.
Yeah.
About the diplomats participating in the CDM. Incidentally, I joined the Foreign Service together with Ambassador John Motun, who is now permanent representative in New York. I quit earlier on, and he stayed on to fight another day. And yes, he is fighting. So I do happen to know that Ambassador John Motun is providing that kind of the information consulting and institutional memory, if you will, support to the NUG Foreign Affairs team. And of course, he continues to represent what he has highlighted as the elected government and not the junta. And for his quote unquote sins in the junta's eyes, of course, reprisal was immediate. He was dismissed and charged with treason. But following John Motun's example, there have been cases of younger diplomats across embassies. And it's interestingly not in any of the Southeast Asian countries, but in embassies in Washington, D.C., embassies in Europe, like Berlin, even the Consulate General, I think, in LA, and the embassy in Tokyo. There are about 40 or so young diplomats who have announced that they are participating in the civil disobedience movement, and this in no way has anything to do with their political affiliation, but that they stand in solidarity with the people. So reprisals have started. There have been dismissals starting with the two diplomats in Tokyo, and I think the other young diplomats who have declared their CDM status are probably also expecting that. So the question here, I think, is whether the support for the CDM movement extends to a certain part to the situation of diplomats now in limbo in this way, and also how their diplomatic recognition by the host country will play out once their visas or their status as diplomatic passport holders has lapsed. So I think these are questions that host governments also will probably need to consider. And linking this to the Burmese diaspora, Anne-Marie, this is where the support of the Burmese diaspora comes in. And as you know, the Myanmar communities across the world are mainly pro-democracy because they had left the country due to different circumstances, either after the 1962 coup or after the 1988 coup, through different ways, different channels, and so on. And I think the NLD quite cannily managed to tap into that core of support, not just for the 2015 elections or the 1990 elections, where overwhelmingly the Burmese diaspora, I think, voted for the NLD, but by Aung San Suu Kyi's nuancing of what she called a people-centered diplomacy in wanting the Burmese embassies abroad to engage with the diaspora, with the community better. and really watch out for their interests and so on. I think that was quite a canny move that also ensured that 2016, sorry, what am I saying, 2020 would see the same kind of the votes coming in from overseas. So I think this is where the Myanmar communities in different countries have stepped up or can step up. They have stepped up in the case of Jomotun. So I think this is something that we need to consider.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in the chat regarding potential US support towards other actors, and a question regarding Thailand as a staging area. The question regarding other actors such as the Chin, there has been arguments, right, that the lesson of Afghanistan's opposition to the Soviets is that the reason the Soviets couldn't assert full control was that the US provided anti-aircraft capacity missiles so that the Soviets in that case couldn't maintain air superiority. Many people argue that if the opposition in Myanmar had weapons to deny the junta air superiority, there would be much fewer casualties. My understanding is only the Chin has some anti-missiles capacity that China has provided them. But my sense is that the US certainly does not want to see the conflict escalate militarily. We've all heard the analogy to Syria, failed state. So in your view, Mo, do you see outside actors providing that kind of support to some of the particularly ethnic groups on the ground, or members of the civil disobedient who have now sought sanctuary and military training there?
This, I think, is one of those really gray areas where there could be a lot of unintended consequences when we come to providing armed support. I don't have all the details, but of course, what we all know is that the Kachin Independence Army, the KIA, and the armed wing of the Karen National Union are the ones that are mainly standing up to the Myanmar military. And, I think this is probably the first time in contemporary history that you've seen a Burma majority crowd cheer on an ethnic armed group for shooting down a military helicopter. So I think this is the kind of pulse that the NUG wants to tap into when they start talking about a federal army and establishing the People's Defense Forces as a prelude to that federal army. But here, we also need to be aware that the military is also trying to woo other armed groups, such as the Arakan Army in Rakhine State, who's up to now, the Arakan Army is staying out of the conflict. They've expressed support, but they're staying out of it. Then the military is also trying to woo, I think, the Shan and the Wa armed groups. So it's really, I think this is where the tension for a legitimacy of another sort is going to come in who gets the full support and cooperation of the ethnic armed groups, and how these different ethnic armed groups are also going to view this potential federal arrangement where each of them have their own political, economic, and social competencies, for example. So I think there are a lot of discussions and negotiations that have to go through. The ethnic armed organizations who earlier signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement under the Thein Sein administration early on declared that they would support the resistance against the coup and stopped talking to their military interlocutors under that peace process, which has now broken down again. And this highlights this whole point that we have to be very aware of as I think people looking in, right? There's this whole history of broken trust and promises in Burma, in Myanmar since independence. And because the military has also tried to broker peace agreements with the ethnic armed groups, not once, but twice. I mean, the military regime of the SLOC, SPDC, tried to do that too, trying to forge gentlemen's agreements, although which side was a gentleman, I don't know. But that fell through. That fell through when the military wanted to scope the ethnic armed groups to come under Burmese command, which they didn't want. And so with this history of broken trust and promises, and of course the elections, annulling the elections, 1990 elections were annulled, and now the SAC has also nullified the 2020 elections, and they are trying to now disband the NLD or declare the NLD as an illegal organization, which they tried to do and succeeded in 2009 as a prelude to the 2010 rigged elections. So I think with this history of broken trust and promises, there will be a lot of, I think, consultations and discussions to be done with the different ethnic stakeholders. And maybe linking that to another question that asked about how do these ethnic armed stakeholders, how do the ethnic nationalities actually view outside actors like ASEAN and the US, for example? ASEAN has stayed out of the peace process. They viewed that initially as something very unique to Myanmar's own domestic situation. So I don't think the ethnic armed groups are that familiar with how ASEAN rolls, how ASEAN works. And so there will, I think, need to be a lot of, I think, awareness discussions about what ASEAN is about when this current proposed process of going in and engaging with all key stakeholders in the country starts. And of course, you know, identifying the military and the NLD as key stakeholders, I think ignores the very complex multi-layered dynamics that we have in Myanmar. And I think we need to be aware of that as well. So currently, I have asked a question to some of my ASEAN friends and colleagues about whether, you know, Thailand becoming again that space for the NGOs and the humanitarian community, similar to what we saw post 1988. So is that going to be another situation where, again, that humanitarian space along the Thai-Myanmar border will somehow be reactivated again in the context of now, you know, so many people going to those areas, you know, to the quote unquote liberated areas, receiving training and so on. And if so, if there is that I don't know, revival, reestablishment, somehow, you know, a recurring of that humanitarian space along the Thai-Myanmar border, how are the current Thai authorities going to view that? So there are these bilateral dynamics, and we all know that the commanders-in-chief of the Thai and the Myanmar militaries are still in close contact. So are there other spaces in ASEAN, in other ASEAN countries that can offer that same kind of, you know, space? Sorry. And all of this, of course, is happening in the midst of another wave of COVID in Southeast Asia. And I think the lack of appetite of many governments to, you know, to intervene before dealing successfully with their own domestic exigencies.
Okay, we are just about out of time, but just following up on your last comment about ASEAN and your last points on your presentation, you know, which were the US, ASEAN, and then China. With regard to response and hopefully forward movement on the coup, I mean, we have had a lot of people saying the United States has very little influence, right? They don't have a lot of economics there. The sanctions, it's mostly on the oil and gas, and they've not been willing to go there. They can do targeted sanctions. The US has supported the ASEAN 5-point consensus. That hasn't seemed to move things forward. China is not happy with, as I understand it, the coup, because it triggers fears of instability. Clearly, there is some common interests, right, between China, the US, ASEAN. Nobody wants to see a failed state in Myanmar. Do you see prospects for coordination between these key actors to try to help incentivize a less violent, more peaceful path forward?
That is, I think, what the ASEAN proposal was trying to do, trying to start discussions, conversations towards an eventual political settlement. So it's kind of a long-term proposition. And I think ASEAN's usefulness here is to provide that coordinating platform. I raised this in the context of talking about the Rohingya issue in some of my articles earlier on about the group of friends, I think, which is an idea that Thailand has taken up. But I would now see, I think what ASEAN needs to do is to serve as that coordinating platform, if you will, for all the international interlocutors, definitely the US and the China, which are important dialogue partners of ASEAN, to talk about this. And ASEAN doing this as a course means that if Myanmar is sitting there in the mix, I think the United States representative would at least have concerns about sitting at the same table with a representative of the junta. So probably a core group of countries in ASEAN who are the key kind of movers of the ASEAN process, of the ASEAN response on Myanmar, could do those minilateral, trilateral type of discussions around which I think that international coalition of the willing, if you will, to assist Myanmar's political crisis first by addressing its humanitarian crisis aspects, could at least have a channel. China, of course, has no qualms of engaging the junta, but at the same time, it cannot help but being concerned about its economic interests. And China has the largest economic footprint in Myanmar. And so I think what we could do, I think we as academics, researchers, policy think tanks, I think what we can do is really to start highlighting the economic costs and implications, not just for Myanmar, not just for the junta or whichever elected government further on down the line will have to face in terms of all these economic implications and consequences, but also the investment and economic and business implications and consequences for anybody who wants to engage with Myanmar and those who are already invested in Myanmar, some since the early 1990s. So I think if we can start highlighting those kinds of costs and implications, it helps policy action, or at least policy consideration on looking at it from that broader perspective, rather than what we are already doing, which is to condemn the junta, to reiterate that there's little tolerance, if any, for this kind of a brutal takeover and using lethal force, killing your own people, and of course returning Myanmar back to that path of democracy, a civilian government, in accordance with the will of the people. So apart from making those statements and of course engaging with the NUG as much as we can, I think we also need to look at how we can enable it to become that counterpart for engagement that we want to see. All of this is all long term, and nothing in Burma or Myanmar happened overnight, and I don't think it's going to go away overnight that easily. I'm sorry to send it to end it on a sad note, but
Well, it's not you, it's the situation, Mo. Thank you so much for that. Murray, do you have a last comment on anything from the US side?
No, I think Mo's last response pretty much sums it up for the US too. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both. I want to thank everybody for attending our discussion today. We've had not only a huge walk through history, but an extremely in-depth discussion of the different actors in the current Myanmar crisis. And certainly Mothuzar has given us a series of policies and things that we can focus all on in our individual roles. I want to thank Sreneeth Poole behind the scenes for making this all happen. And most of all, I want to thank Mothuzar and Murray Hebert for being here today and sharing all of their expertise. We will be using their insights as we watch how events unfold. And I hope that when the pandemic's over and we can all get back together again in person and have more conversations on Myanmar, that the situation will have changed and we will be able to end on a more optimistic note. So with that, thank you all. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Murray. And I look forward to seeing you all in the future.